GLM 5.2 hits 502 tokens per second on Together AI. That's 3 times faster than DeepSeek V4 Pro's best speed. But DeepSeek's output tokens cost 5 times less, and at 1,000,000 tokens a day, that gap is real money. Both models dropped recently, and everyone's picking sides without the numbers to back it up. So I went through official model cards, artificial analysis benchmarks, and community reports, comparing GLM 5.2 versus DeepSeek V4 Pro across 5 tests. Every claim is sourced. The final score is closer than you'd think, but there's one dimension where the cheaper model pulls ahead in a way that could flip your whole infrastructure decision, and that answer shows up in the pricing test. My name is Brian, and I'm in these tools 12 hours a day, so you don't have to be. I went through every number both companies actually stand behind, official docs, independent benchmarks, and community reports, and I scored only where I found verified, comparable data. Let's get into it. You've probably heard both of these models are great at reasoning, and yeah, they kind of are. But if you're running a high-volume pipeline, say 100,000 API calls a month, the wrong pick costs you thousands of dollars or seconds of latency you can't get back. And that's what this comparison is actually about. Test 1, reasoning and coding benchmarks. When your model fails a production coding task, you're not just debugging, you're explaining to your team why you picked the wrong tool. GLM 5.2 sits at 89.5% on GPQA Diamond, and DeepSeek V4 Pro is right behind at 90.1%. So which one actually codes better at the frontier? What surprised me is how split the results are. GLM 5.2 leads the AA Intelligence Index at 51, highest among open weights models, while DeepSeek V4 Pro hits 93.5% on live code bench and max reasoning mode, and leads the GDP Val AA ELO at 1554 versus 1524. I looked at the SWE bench numbers too, but they're on different benchmarks entirely, so I'm not counting those head-to-head. Take this with a grain of salt. The gap between these two on reasoning is genuinely tiny. GPQA Diamond is 0.6% apart, which is basically noise. Each model leads on different benchmarks, and some of the comparisons aren't even apples to apples, so calling a clear winner here would be misleading. Reasoning and coding, it's a tie. GLM 5.2's AA Intelligence Index lead looked promising, but DeepSeek V4 Pro's live code bench score keeps this dead even, and neither model takes it. Score stays at 0 to 0, one tied. Test 2, pricing and value. Here's a concrete scenario, a solo developer running a document processing pipeline at 10 million output tokens a month. At GLM 5.2's rate of 440 per million output tokens, that's $44 a month. Same workload on DeepSeek V4 Pro at 0.87K per million, that's 8.70. Same job, 1/5 the cost. I pulled the official API pricing and the gap is pretty wild. DeepSeek V4 Pro charges 0.435 per million input tokens versus GLM 5.2's 1.40, so about 3x cheaper on input, and on output it's 0.87 versus 440, which is 5 times cheaper. Then DeepSeek's cached input rate comes in at 0.004 per million tokens compared to 0.26 for GLM 5.2, and that 99% cache discount was something I genuinely didn't see coming. DeepSeek V4 Pro takes pricing, no contest. A gap made sense, but 5 times cheaper on output tokens, plus a 99% cache discount, that's not a marginal difference. That's a completely different cost structure. DeepSeek V4 Pro goes up 1, GLM 5.2 still at 0, one tied. Test 3, speed and latency. 502 tokens per second, that's GLM 5.2's peak on Together AI, and if you're running a real-time application where users are watching output stream in, the difference between 64 and 106 tokens per second sustained is the difference between a product that feels fast and one that feels broken. GLM 5.2 is clearly faster on sustained output, 106 tokens per second average across providers versus 64 for DeepSeek V4 Pro, and peak speed on Together AI hits 502 TOC-OS for GLM 5.2 versus 167 for DeepSeek. What's interesting though is DeepSeek V4 Pro actually wins on time to first token at 0.99 seconds versus 1.36 seconds, so it starts faster, but GLM 5.2 runs faster once it gets going. GLM 5.2 takes speed. DeepSeek's faster first token response looked like it might matter more, but for high throughput workloads, sustained output at 106 TOC-AS versus 64 is the number that actually moves the needle. GLM 5.2 goes to 1, DeepSeek V4 Pro stays at 1, still 1 tied. 2 tests left, context window and multilingual support, and the context window result is where things get genuinely interesting, because both models match on size but they're not equal on efficiency, and that gap could matter a lot depending on your use case. Test 4, context window and document handling. Both tools handle 1 million tokens, you've probably heard that. But if you're processing a 500-page legal document and your model burns through compute just to hold the context, you're paying for inefficiency you can't see, and that's the real question. How well each model actually uses the window, not just how big it is. Both models match at 1 million tokens, that part's clean, and GLM 5.2 supports a 128K output tokens per response, which is great for long-form generation, but I couldn't find a comparable output cap for DeepSeek V4 Pro. What surprised me is DeepSeek's long context efficiency. It runs at just 27% flops and 10% KV cache at 1 million tokens and scores 83.5 on the MRCR1M retrieval benchmark, and I couldn't find a GLM 5.2 figure for either of those. Context window is a tie. Each model brings something different. GLM 5.2 on output length, DeepSeek V4 Pro on efficiency, and I couldn't get a clean head-to-head on the metrics that would actually decide it. Scores stay at 1-1, now 2 tied. Test 5, multilingual support. Ship a product to a non-English market, and your model starts degrading on Chinese or Spanish queries. And you find out fast that language coverage wasn't something you checked before you signed the contract. So which of these two models actually tells you what languages they support? This one was frustrating to research. GLM 5.2 explicitly lists English and Chinese in its model card. That's at least something concrete, but I couldn't find any published multilingual benchmark scores for GLM 5.2, and I couldn't find any multilingual support data at all for DeepSeek V4 Pro. No scores, no language tags, nothing. So the on-screen cards here are mostly empty, and that's the honest answer. Multilingual, no winner. Neither model has published enough data to score this fairly, so the final tally sits at GLM 5.21, DeepSeek V4 Pro 1, 3 tied. Alright, so here's where GLM 5.2 wins outright. Sustained output speed is 106 tokens versus 64. That's 1.7 times faster, and peak speed on Together AI hits 502 tokens, 3 times DeepSeek's best. It leads the AA Intelligence Index at 51, the highest open weight score out there, and it supports on 128K output tokens per response, which is genuinely useful for long-form generation tasks. Now here's where DeepSeek V4 Pro wins. It's 3 times cheaper on input tokens and 5 times cheaper on output. And that 99% cache discount at 0.004 per million cached tokens is something GLM 5.2 can't touch. It also starts responding faster at 0.99 seconds to first token versus 1.36, and it leads on live code bench at 93.5% and GDP val AALO at 1554. So the overall result ended up tighter than I expected. 1 win each, 3 ties. But the decision rule is actually pretty clean. If you need raw throughput and your product lives or dies on response speed, GLM 5.2 is your pick, running at 502 tokens per second at peak with nothing else at this price point. Coming close. If you're optimizing for cost at scale, DeepSeek V4 Pro wins. Output tokens at roughly 1/5 the price, and that's the number that matters. I ran GLM 5.2 against Claude Opus 4.8 next, and the intelligence gap gets way more interesting. GLM 5.2 actually holds its own on the AA index, but the price story flips completely, and that comparison is already on the channel if you want to keep going.